Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to the annual Bugbee Lecture, which is part of the Presidential Lecture Series. On behalf of the family and friends of Henry Bugbee and the Department of Philosophy, let me thank President Dennison for his support of this lecture tonight. Henry Bugbee died in 1999. He was a long-term resident of Missoula and Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Montana. Henry was teaching here for about 20 years, 1957 through 1977. And though he retired, properly speaking, roughly 30 years ago, his presence is still clearly felt in the department. I've only been in the department 6 months or so, and I have heard hundreds of stories about Henry. It's absolutely remarkable. His presence is again with us. From what I've been told of Henry Bugbee, it's clear that he achieved something wonderful, which remains elusive to many philosophers. Namely, his philosophical work had a felt influence beyond merely his students and colleagues, but to a larger audience. And this is clear from his experience and work on wilderness and his testimony at wilderness hearings. And I think that he shares with our speaker tonight, Professor Michael Ruse, who also achieves this aim of having philosophical work that matters to a larger audience. Professor Ruse earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Bristol in 1970. After many years of teaching at the University of Guelph, he accepted an endowed chair at Florida State University in 2000. Since 2004, he's been the director of the program in the History and Philosophy of Science. Professor Ruse has written or edited over 30 books, with 7 due out in the next 2 years. Let me name a few. Philosophy of Biology, The Darwinian Revolution, Science Read in Tooth and Claw, Sociobiology, Sense or Nonsense, Monad to Man, The Concept of Progress in Evolutionary Biology, Mystery of Mysteries, Is Evolution a Social Construction? Can a Darwinian be a Christian? The relationship between science and religion. Darwin and design. Does evolution have a purpose? The evolution-creation struggle. Darwinism and its discontents. I think I'm not exaggerating here to say he's one of the world's foremost experts on evolution and creation as well. Let me say a bit more about his work. Thomas Kuhn opened his landmark book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, with the following quote: "History, if viewed as more than a repository for chronology and anecdote, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are possessed." Professor Ruse has produced a decisive transformation of our view of the evolution-creation debate or struggle by tracing the history of ideas which inform them both. Though Professor Ruse is a thoroughgoing Darwinian, his work displays a deep and sympathetic knowledge of Christianity. Unlike many an author on this subject, Professor Ruse's work generates more light than heat, and I'm sure the same will be true tonight. Professor Ruse's talk is entitled The Evolution-Creation Debate, an American Story. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Professor Michael Ruse.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to your wonderful state. I have a bad tendency to move around, so if I start doing that and you can't hear what I'm saying, don't hesitate to yell at me, because everybody else does, and get me back in front of the mic. I'm really excited about what I've got to say tonight, not necessarily because I'm going to do it better than anybody else, but because this is a topic that I find really important, and I hope to be able to share some ideas with you tonight. You might think, because already I take it that you've realized that I was not born in America, that in fact I come from England, you might think, oh God, another Brit's going to come and do a job on us Americans. He's going to talk the evolution-creation struggle or controversy, a very American story. Oh gosh, we've heard the Brits doing this sort of thing before. I want to assure you that this is not what I'm going to be doing tonight. I should say that I'm perfectly capable of giving talks which run down Americans. There are times when I rather enjoy doing this. I have only to get onto the subject of Bud Light, and I'm positively loquacious. Any country which thinks that Diet Pepsi is an acceptable accompaniment to a meal, in my opinion, has big problems. So I do want you to assure you that I'm not a warm and fuzzy person. Nevertheless, that's not what I'm about tonight. I want to talk about ideas. I want to talk about a contemporary struggle, a contemporary problem. And the way I want to do this is by going into the past and bringing us up to the present to show you why we are where we are at this moment. So although I don't want to make any bones about where I stand, I'm an ardent evolutionist, and I think that creationism is fundamentally mistaken. At another level, my purpose tonight is more of a prolegomenon. I want to try to understand, why is it that a country which has the greatest science culture that the world has ever known, every fall, almost all Nobel Prizes, last year every one in the sciences was won by a native-born American. Why is it that a country which produces this science nevertheless has 50% of its inhabitants who think that the dinosaurs and the cavemen roamed the world together? How can this be? And so this basically is the issue that I'm going to be tackling tonight. So, just to show you that I'm not dealing with a straw man or a straw person, let me introduce to you the two sides. On the one hand, there are my fellow Darwinians. Even I am somewhat embarrassed by the fact that they call themselves the Brights. I mean, really, I always thought I was the most immodest person the world had ever known. But if anybody could go round saying, well, I'm a Bright, how about you? Are you a Bright, or are you, as thick as two short planks nailed together? But anyhow, these are certainly a number of the very ardent Darwinians. On the far left, up in the top corner, is Steven Pinker, the Harvard linguist. Then next to him is Stephen Bezos, who founded Amazon.com. The chap in the middle with the heavy-duty beard, looking a little bit like St. Paul, is Dan Dennett, the Cambridge, Massachusetts philosopher. And just to his right, the sort of last but one on the right, sitting down, that's Richard Dawkins, who's written this book, The God Delusion, in which he argues very strongly that if you're a scientist, particularly if you're a Darwinian, you cannot possibly accept anything religious. And in fact, you ought to be a Darwinian, therefore religious people are all silly, crazy, or downright evil. They're the people who subscribe very strongly to the idea of evolution. I love this one. It says, Darwin approved, created in 27 days, not 7. But these are the people who believe that everything on this earth came by a long, slow process of organic development, up from blobs, right up to good, healthy beer drinkers at the end. On the other side, we've got today they're less known as the creationists. The most recent manifestation is that of the intelligent designers. I shall say a bit more about this towards the end. Their eminence grise is a man who's now retired. He's a University of California at Berkeley law professor, and this is Philip Johnson, who wrote a little book called Darwin on Trial some years ago. And these are the people who believe that evolution is inadequate and that at some point down the line, you have to invoke a miracle. You have to invoke an intelligent designer who was involved in the creation, not just at the beginning, but on an ongoing basis. So, as I say, these are the two sides that as it were, set my, this is my prolegomena, if you like. These are the two sides who set my story. On the one hand, we've got the evolutionists, the Darwinians, people like Dan Dennett and Richard Dawkins. On the other hand, we've got at least today, we've got the intelligent designers, people like Philip Johnson. And what makes the debate, I think, particularly interesting to me is that for all that the Darwinians call themselves the brights, this isn't really quite true, because, in fact, the intelligent designers, taken person for person, are, in fact, equally bright and equally well educated. Philip Johnson, for instance, was an undergraduate at Harvard and then top of his class at the University of Chicago Law School, and was the clerk for the Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren when he was head of the Supreme Court. So in a way, what makes this whole debate interesting is that we do have interesting and educated and intelligent people on both sides. And so what I want to know is why do we have this debate? And particularly, why do we have this debate in America? I'm not saying that it doesn't occur anywhere else, but generally, if not almost exclusively, certainly in the Western world, it's because it's been exported from America. So, as I say, this is my question: why do we have this clash in 2007? Well, to start the story, let's go right back to the beginning. And for the benefit of nervous titters in the audience, do I really think this is the beginning? Well, wait and see. For the benefit of the philosophers in the audience, this is Adam and Eve. I have to explain that. Philosophers. Yes, boys, it's Adam on the left-hand side, okay? The reason why I'm showing you this is truly, it's not because I want to convince you of the literal truth of Adam and Eve. I certainly don't want to do that. But because I want to start my talk proper by talking about Christianity. The fact is that Christianity didn't just sort of appear full-blown, wholesale, as it were, at some point in history. When Jesus died, when Jesus rose, when Jesus went up to heaven, there wasn't a religion called Christianity. In fact, Jesus himself spoke in very apocalyptic terms, and there's good reason to think, at least until the end, that he rather thought that things weren't going to turn out quite as they did. Certainly, after Jesus had gone, it fell upon his disciples and his followers to start to create Christianity both theologically and socially. And this, of course, was the work first of St. Peter, and then most particularly of St. Paul. And if you read Paul's epistles, this is what Paul is trying to do in these epistles. He's trying to articulate, first of all, what the meaning of Jesus was, and then how one ought to behave, particularly if the end is not going to come in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And these are the sorts of things that Paul is doing. In fact, it took about 4 centuries for the great theologians at the beginning of the Christian era, the so-called church fathers, to work out fully an overall comprehensive theology. And probably the most important of them all was this man, and this, of course, is St. Augustine. I like this picture of St. Augustine. He's, as I say, he's normally presented as sort of looking a little bit like me, only older, in a bedsheet, looking very sort of sincere. But as we know, he was really quite a lad in his youth, and he's famous for the prayer of, "Oh God, make me good, but not just yet." That's his mother down there praying that he'll convert, St. Monica, and it's St. Ambrose up in the top right-hand corner who, in fact, did convert Augustine to Christianity. Now, as a young man, before he converted to Christianity, as a young man, Augustine was very much attracted to a group, what we now call heretical, but a kind of a rival interpretation of Christianity known as the Manichaeans. And the Manichaeans had various beliefs, including the belief in two gods, a good one and a bad one. But most particularly, the Manichaeans rejected the Old Testament. You see, this was a big debate amongst the early Christians. What should our position be towards the Old Testament? After all, the Jews rejected Jesus. Shouldn't we therefore not only reject the Jews, but we should reject their sacred writings? And the Manichaeans did this. And one of the things that the Manichaeans would do with the more Orthodox Christians, by Orthodox I don't mean Greek Orthodox, but I mean those more central Christians, was the Manichaeans were very good at pointing out the problems with the Old Testament, the sort of two creation stories and things like that. Now, when Augustine converted, or perhaps reconverted, to Christianity, he then accepted the Old Testament. And he said there are very good reasons for accepting the Old Testament, namely, it makes sense of the New Testament. Why did Jesus have to come? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? For our sins. Why are we sinful? Well, because of Adam and Eve. In other words, the Old Testament sets the context for the New Testament. But St. Augustine knew the problems with the Old Testament, having been a Manichaean. So he said to his fellow Christians, of course, the Old Testament is true all the way through, but often it's not necessarily literally true. God was writing for the ancient Jews, nomadic people who were not educated like us Romans in the 4th and 5th century AD. And so, in fact, one shouldn't even look for literal scientific truth in the Old Testament. So the point I want to make right at the start is that traditional Christianity has never been literalist Christianity. So if somebody says to you, I'm a traditional Christian because I take the Bible literally, you can say, well, you may take the Bible literally, but in fact, you're not a traditional Christian. And this is an important point I want to make, because I am going to be dealing with literalism later on, and I want to see why it is that this came into being. It wasn't something that came into being because this was always the Christian tradition. I don't mean that St. Augustine didn't accept Adam and Eve. He certainly did. But what he did was set up the kind of methodology which said, if in fact science and philosophy of these things show that you cannot or should not take the Old Testament literally, then not only is this an acceptable move to make, but it might indeed be an obligatory move to make. Now, what I want to do now is I want to move forward a millennium and a half very rapidly. Most people, in fact, I think I too, would want to say, if we're looking at the history of Western Christianity, I'm not now talking about the split from the East in around 1000 AD, but if we're looking at the history of Western Christianity, surely the biggest event, the big event, was the Reformation. I think one can hardly deny this. This is when Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and the others broke away from Catholicism. But in fact, what you'd find is that many historians of Christianity today would say, well, in many respects, you could argue that there was an even bigger event in the history of Western Christianity. And this was the period at the beginning of the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment. And why was this so important? Well, because now, for the first time, people started to wrestle with the possibility that maybe Christianity is not true. Of course, the great reformers like Luther and Calvin, they thought that the Catholics were wrong, but they never wanted to deny the truth that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. I mean, the question is, what should we do in the light of this? At the beginning of the 18th century, the first time people started to wrestle with the idea that maybe none of it is true at all. There were a number of reasons why this came about. Obviously, one was science. I mean, Copernicus putting the sun at the center and then thinking that the whole universe is infinite and we're just a tiny speck and no longer right at the center. Obviously, things like philosophy were important. I mean, Descartes was always a sincere Catholic, but nevertheless, Descartes introduced his notion of methodological doubt and opened the way to start doubting about God and these sorts of things. Probably the most important of all, though, was the encounter between the people of Europe and the great civilizations of the East, India and China and Japan. Because here, for the first time, the Europeans met people who clearly weren't savages, who'd got sophisticated civilizations and even more sophisticated religions. And there was no mention of Jesus Christ anywhere in any of these. And people started to say, gosh, what's going on here? How could it be that these people don't know about Jesus if Jesus is the Redeemer? The English, I should say, got into particular trouble on this because the English always opposed missionary work. The English loathed, well, they just forbade missionaries going out east, at least until the Victorian era, because they saw that once you start converting people to new religions, this is going to foment religious strife, and this is going to be bad for trade. And so the English particularly were keen on saying things like, what right have we got to put down the Hindus or the Buddhists or the Confucians or something like that in the name of Christianity? Now, they were being hypocrites, but of course the thing is, they said these sorts of things and people started to take them seriously. So by the beginning of the 18th century, there was a growing feeling that maybe, gosh, we've made a big mistake, maybe Christianity is not right. Now, by and large, people did not at once become atheists. Some of the French did, but of course, as we well know, the French never know when to stop. They go way too far. And certainly this was the case. But by and large, most people became what is known as deists. They became believers in a kind of universal God, a God who'd set things going, an unmoved mover, but who then stood back and didn't interfere with the creation. And so this was a very general position. And I think that what you find in the 18th century, in the face of this kind of crisis, is two responses. Faith or reason. As I say, by the beginning of the 18th century, this was, people were really realizing that Christianity was under threat. And what was the response? Well, the one response was to say, stop, we've gone too far. We must emphasize, the thing is, reason has led us into this doubting of the great truths of religion. What we must do is not give up reason, but we must make the heart, we must make the sentiment, we must make feelings our absolute beginning. And it doesn't matter what reason says, ultimately it must be a matter of faith, of belief. And what I want to say, and I shall be developing this, is I think that in respects we're going to see an intellectual line from this down through the present in America to the creationists, to the intelligent designers and others like that. The others were the people who said, reason's taken us this far, let's push reason all the way, and we must accept reason all the way. And one of the things I want to point out, is that almost immediately, evolution, the idea of going from the blob up to the human, got caught up in this particular debate. Evolution came into being in the 18th century, and it was never a theory-neutral notion. It was always something which was bound up particularly with this debate. And what we find is that the deists and others like this were people who took up the notion of evolution. Because, in fact, the big dichotomy at this point was was not over the Bible true or false, because as I've explained to you, there's always been this tradition that one could interpret the Bible, and in fact the great reformers continued this tradition. I mean, Calvin, for instance, said explicitly that God accommodates his language to the ignorant. So it was never in the 18th century over the Bible true or false, or literal or whatever. It was much more over the idea of faith, of owing everything to God, of humbly standing before God and saying, I'm sorry, thank you. The idea that God controls everything, providence, a providential God who is prepared to intervene in the creation as he did through sending Jesus for our salvation. And progress, the idea that, okay, folks, we can do this ourselves. We don't need God, or at least we don't need God in that sort of way. We've got the skills, we've got the energy, we've got the abilities. Now, let's improve society through medicine and education and these sorts of things. So the big dichotomy, as I say, in the 18th century is not over literalism, but over providence versus progress. To give you an example of two people who are caught up in this, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, was very much on providence. He was the man who at Eastertide said, "My heart felt curiously warmed." And of course, we see this in the great Protestant hymns. I mean, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my greatest gains I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. I am nothing. I am a sinner. I can do nothing on my own except through the blood of the Lamb. The other position, which is exemplified above all by Benjamin Franklin, is to say, no, folks, God doesn't work that way. It's Franklin did not think that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He thought that Jesus was a good bloke, but he was not divine. God does not work that way. We have got our, if you like, our God-given abilities, and now it's our job to roll up our sleeves and get to work. Progress. We've got to make things better ourselves. In fact, Franklin said at the time of the American Revolution, he said, my great regret is I won't be alive 100 years from now to see how America has progressed. Remember, Franklin is interested in political economy, he's interested in industry, and of course, above all, he's interested in science. Now, the thing is, evolution gets caught up in this debate. A good friend of Benjamin Franklin was the English physician at the end of the 18th century, Erasmus Darwin. He's the grandfather, in fact, of Charles Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin, who, as I say, was a friend of Franklin, and in fact, Erasmus Darwin was very keen, as a lot of English people were, on the American Revolution, was absolutely committed to the notion of progress, that through work we can make things better. But more than this, what Erasmus Darwin did was read the idea of progress into the organic world, and I'm going to show you a picture now, in fact, from the 19th century, but this is the kind of picture of evolution that Erasmus Darwin had. He read the idea of progress into the organic world, which gave him evolution, going all the way from the monad or the primitive, all the way up to humans. And then, of course, what he did was take his biological notions and, as it were, in a good circular fashion, say, and therefore we see that socially we have progress and that we should strive to have it. So, as I say, this is the debate that we've got in the 18th century. And right from the beginning, evolution is caught up in this, although it's not just a question of biblical literalism, crude or otherwise. Well, now, let's move along to Erasmus Darwin's grandson, and this is Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809, he died in 1882. In fact, Charles Darwin was born on February the 12th, 1809, the same day that Abraham Lincoln was born across the Atlantic. This is a picture that you're looking at the moment of Charles Darwin when he was about 30. He's just about to marry his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And this is a wedding portrait which was painted. It's just about 2 or 3 years before photography comes in. Our first photo of Darwin is about 1842. So this is painted in 1839. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that it's a very good portrait. It's a very good quality watercolor. The reason why it's a good quality watercolor is because it was painted by George Richmond, and George Richmond was the best portraitist in England at the time. And that tells you something about Darwin right there. Namely, he came from a society or segment of society that could afford to have the best portraitist in England paint his portrait. The Darwins, they were not aristocrats, but they were solid upper middle class Britons. They weren't just solid upper middle class Britons. These were people who were rich. These were people who were stinking rich. I mean, these were people who had Silicon Valley money rich. The reason being that Darwin's maternal grandfather, his maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, the potter. And Wedgwood had made a huge amount of money at the end of the 18th century. And this passed on down to his descendants. And remember, I told you that Darwin got married. He married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And so the Darwins were really very, very well off indeed. Now, the reason I tell you this is not because, partly because I'm envious, of course, but I mean, the real reason I'm telling you this is that you should not, therefore, expect to find Darwin being a rebel, at least in that sense. You should not expect to find Darwin repudiating his past. You should not expect to find Darwin saying, oh, well, I think I'll become an atheist, and, oh, by the way, I'll add evolution to it just to upset everybody. I mean, Darwin wasn't that sort of person. Darwin came from a very solid, comfortable part of Britain, and he liked it, and he was not going to rebel in that sense. Now, I think Darwin was, in fact, a great revolutionary, but his revolution was to take the parts of the past, the parts that were given to him, and turn them around rather like a kaleidoscope and make a new picture. And I think that this was indeed, as I'll explain, a very great revolution. So the point I'm making is that Darwin was not the Christian God who made things out of nothing, but he made things out of things that he got, especially including religion. And this is an important part of my story. Now, Darwin started life as he started his university career in Edinburgh, and the idea was that he was going to become a physician. But after 2 years, he absolutely hated that. And so after hurried family discussions, and what do you do with a young man who's 19, he's attractive, he's not particularly hardworking, he knows that there's family money, he'll never have to work for a living, but they don't want him to be an idle layabout. What are you going to do with him? Well, today I suppose you say, oh, well, go to the University of Montana and take philosophy or something like that. It has no social value, but it'll keep you off the streets for 4 years. They didn't have philosophy degrees in those days, but there was an alternative. Make a clergyman out of him, particularly make an Anglican, or what you'd call an Episcopalian. It was a job which was a job for a gentleman. It was not particularly demanding. You didn't have to have a very high IQ to be a clergyman. If you got money, you could hire a curate to do all the dirty work for you. Your wife and your daughters could run the village school. It was a perfect job for somebody like Darwin. So he spent 3 years at Cambridge training to become a clergyman. He never took orders, not because he consciously decided not to, but because in 1831 he got the offer to go on board HMS Beagle, a British warship, which was going to spend some 5 years mapping South America. And Darwin rapidly evolved into the ship's naturalist and into a very keen young geologist and biologist, and basically never looked back. He started the voyage certainly as a completely committed Christian, a theist, but probably sometime in the middle of the voyage, his beliefs started to fade away, and he became something of a deist, believing in God as an unmoved mover. Darwin, I should say, never became an atheist. Probably right through the writing of The Origin of Species, he was a deist, believing in some kind of God. Later in life, particularly because he hated the idea of eternal damnation, he gave up religion entirely. But as I say, at this point, he's something of a deist. Now, a deist is somebody who's looking for God working his way in the world, not through miracles, but through unbroken law. So, as you can see already, evolution far from being something which is going to go against one's religious beliefs, is going to be something which supports one's religious beliefs, particularly if you come from a manufacturing family, as Darwin did, who believe in progress, that you can make things better through industry and hard work and these sorts of things. So in a way, it was almost natural that Darwin fell into evolution, particularly since he'd read his grandfather's works and things like that. Now, there were causes, and particularly for Darwin, the big experience was going to the Galapagos archipelago in 1835, where he and Fitzroy had supper with the governor. And the governor pointed out to them, they didn't realize that the governor pointed out that they weren't in fact eating chicken, but they were eating tortoise. And then the governor says, the incredible thing is, from one island to the next, you have different tortoises and you can tell where they come from. And that really shocked Darwin. He'd just been in South America, where he'd seen the same species of bird sometimes in the steamy jungles of Brazil and in the snowy deserts of Patagonia down at the bottom of South America. So Darwin knew that organisms didn't have to be tied that tightly to their habitat, and yet God so loved the Galapagos that God had put different tortoises, and it turned out different birds, on different islands in the Galapagos, and that just didn't make sense. Now, Darwin didn't become an evolutionist until he went home and showed his bird specimens that he'd been collecting to an eminent ornithologist, and the ornithologist said these are definitely different species. And so at this point, Darwin slipped over into being an evolutionist. Very interesting, Darwin does not become an evolutionist because of the fossils. I mean, people often say, why do you believe in evolution? Oh, well, I believe in evolution because of the fossils. Or, why don't you believe in evolution? Well, I don't believe in evolution because of the gaps in the fossil record. Now, Darwin was sensitive to the fossils, but the thing which actually made him into an evolutionist was the distribution of the organisms around the world, particularly the distribution of those organisms on the Galapagos. The only way that he could make sense of this was through evolution, and so in 1837 he opened some private notebooks where he was going to try to think these things through. Now, Darwin was a graduate of the University of Cambridge, and the greatest scientist that the University of Cambridge had ever had was two centuries before, Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton's great contribution as a scientist was not the Copernican revolution, that was Copernicus, or it wasn't the planets, that was Kepler, it wasn't cannonballs, that was Galileo. It was to bring everything together in one theory under one causal hypothesis, namely that all bodies attract each other according to the inverse of the square of the distance between them. So what Newton did was provide a cause, a force that explained everything. And so what Darwin wanted to do, and spent the next 18 months working on, was to find a cause, a Newtonian type force that would explain in the organic world as Newton had done in the inorganic world. Now, Darwin recognized pretty quickly that the way in which you change organisms is by selecting. You pick from the ones that you want and you reject those that you don't. And of course this led to grossly oversized pigs and very shaggy sheep and beefy cows, and most particularly the turnip, the rutabaga, because this was something that farmers could use to keep animals alive over winter. They didn't have to kill them all off in the fall. An agricultural revolution, I should say, which was going on in England at this time, was not pure chance. They'd had a great industrial revolution, and that meant people left the land and went to the cities. So there were far fewer people on the land, feeding far more people in the cities, so they got to do these things much more efficiently. And it turned out that the way you do things efficiently is by producing better crops, and the way you produce better crops is by selecting the ones that you want and rejecting those that you don't. So Darwin recognized very quickly that selection was the key to change. Darwin also recognized that selection doesn't just produce new forms, it produces new forms of a kind that you want, or they're as if designed. And this was important for Darwin because as an undergraduate at Cambridge, he'd had to read the works of the Reverend William Paley, Archdeacon William Paley. And Paley was the grand expositor of the so-called argument from design. Why should we believe in the existence of God? Well, the eye, the human eye, is like a telescope. Telescopes have telescope makers, therefore the eye must have an eye maker, namely God. Now, Darwin wanted to reject at least the great optician in the sky who was doing it by miracles, but he agreed completely with Paley that the world, the organic world, is as if designed, and he recognized that selection, a natural form of selection, would get this for him. But he couldn't quite see how it is that selection actually works. And in 1838, at the end of 1838, he read a very conservative tract by a man called Thomas Robert Malthus. And this, of course, illustrates completely what I was saying earlier. You see, Darwin has become an evolutionist because of his deism. He doesn't invent deism, he gets this, and then he applies it. Now what we're seeing is Darwin becoming a Darwinian, in other words, discovering his mechanism of natural selection because of his Christian background. He's read Paley, he accepts with Paley that the world is if designed, and he recognizes that selection can do this. But he needs another element, and he gets it from this man. Malthus was worried about why we do anything. Why do we actually get up and do anything all day long? Why don't we, I've got a daughter called Emily, whom I love dearly, but why don't we all behave like Emily Ruse does? We get up about 11 o'clock in the morning, or so. We come downstairs, we demand a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, then we want breakfast. We hang around for a couple of hours, a bit moody, a bit bad-tempered, then we go back upstairs, and then all the hot water's gone, and about 4 o'clock we appear again, we want more food, and then, oh, by the way, my car's empty, and can I have $20? And so we set off about 7 o'clock at night, and by which time we're waking up properly, and we're back at 3 in the morning. And we go to bed, and then we start again the next day. Now, why don't we all adopt a lifestyle like that? What the hell? It's a lot better than having to come to Montana and get up and give lectures and this sort of thing. I mean, why are we neurotic like Michael Ruse? Why aren't we well-balanced like Emily Ruse? Well, the answer is, said Malthus, God was worried about this problem. God thought this was a serious problem, but God fixed it. God made our reproductive desires, and obviously God was anticipating Emily Ruse on this, God made our reproductive desires stronger than our ability to find food and space. In other words, there's going to be what Malthus called struggles for existence as people try to survive against the pressures of population pressure. Now, notice Malthus, in fact, is offering a very conservative, non-progressive view. Malthus is basically saying state welfare is useless because you start off with 10 Emily Ruses, you give them state welfare, and in the next generation you're going to have 20 of them, or 40 of them, or 80 of them. It's pointless. So Malthus is being very conservative. Darwin takes Malthus. He says, yes, in the organic world there's going to be this struggle for existence, and more importantly, this struggle for reproduction. This will set up a population pressure. Some will get through, some won't. And those that do get through will be different from those that don't. And they'll get through on average because they've got features that the losers don't have. They'll be that little bit stronger, or that little bit brighter, or that little bit randier, or whatever it might be. And this will enable them to get through, and others won't. So there will be a natural form of selection. And I'm showing you now a couple of the birds that Darwin would have seen on the Galapagos. These were actually painted by the ship's artist. These are Darwin's finches, and I point out their very big beaks, which are as if designed. In fact, they're as if designed in order to eat cactus and nuts and things like that. There are other Darwin's finches with very fine beaks. They're insectivorous. So in other words, with natural selection, a natural form of selection, Darwin had not only got a mechanism had not only explained evolution, he'd got a mechanism of change, but a mechanism of change which spoke to what Darwin thought was the most important aspect of the living world, namely, it's adaptive, it works, it functions, it is as if designed. And this was Darwin published in his great work on the origin of species some 20 years later. We're not quite sure why there was the delay, but there was a delay, and it didn't come out until 1859, in which Darwin argued that evolution through natural selection brought on by a struggle for existence leading to adaptation. Now, if you were to pause at this point and say, well, where are we at? And particularly, what's the religious response going to be? My hypothesis, if you like, would be something like this. Obviously, Darwin is going to disturb religious people, no question about that. But after all, religious people had had to learn to accept Copernicus, so why wouldn't they accept Darwin? I mean, after all, particularly if the tradition of Christianity has always been, if the science works, then you've got to mold your Christianity around it, or your religion around it. And after all, if Darwin isn't turning his back on religion, Darwin isn't saying the world is a mess, Darwin is in fact exalting and trying to explain those very things that Christians count so very important, things like design and these sorts of things. So why wouldn't Christians at some level maybe have to work on Darwin, have to work on, particularly if there are going to be any notions of progress. But why couldn't they, at some level, accommodate themselves to Darwinism? Why was there such a big row after Darwin published? And the answer is that in part, in a large part, many Christians found that they could accept Darwinism. In my opinion, the greatest churchman, certainly the greatest English-speaking churchman of the 19th century was John Henry Newman, the man who started as an evangelical Christian and then led the high church movement in Oxford, the Oxford movement, and then in 1845 converted to Catholicism and ended as a cardinal of the church. And universities all over still have Newman clubs, which are named after John Henry Newman. And Newman was asked about Darwin. The question was whether to give Darwin an honorary degree at Oxford University. And Newman said, why not? He said, as far as I'm concerned, what Darwin has to say has nothing whatsoever to do with my Christianity. My Christianity, my God is the God of love, the God of mercy, the God who cared so much for me that he died on the cross. He said, I'm not bothered by Darwinism. St. Augustine says that we're allowed to believe these things if science proves themselves. So as far as I'm concerned, Darwinism is no big issue for me whatsoever. And in fact, we find that many Christians, certainly in Britain, in Europe, and certainly in the northern parts of the US, by about 1870, many Christians had in fact been able to take evolution on board. A lot of them had trouble with natural selection, but so also did a lot of scientists. But certainly by about 1870, evolution was generally accepted by an awful lot of religious Christian people. And yet there was a row. In fact, probably the biggest row occurred with this man. This is Thomas Henry Huxley, the man who called himself Darwin's bulldog, the great propagandist for evolution in the second part of the 19th century. He's the grandfather of Aldous Huxley, the novelist. And Huxley is famous for his debate with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce. That's the father of William Wilberforce, who's being celebrated at the moment, Amazing Grace, as the man who led Britain, the British Empire, away from the slave trade. And Samuel Wilberforce was William's son. And Samuel Wilberforce was a very high church Anglican Episcopalian bishop, the Bishop of Oxford. And Huxley and Wilberforce squared off in 1860, and there's a story, I think it's probably apocryphal, where supposedly Wilberforce turned to Huxley and said, "Tell me, Professor Huxley, are you descended from monkeys on your grandfather's side or your grandmother's side?" And Huxley said, "Well, I'd rather be descended from a monkey than from a bishop of the Church of England." In other words, everybody had a very good time. Now, the question I want to ask is why, if in fact, as I've said, it seems to me that Christians have the apparatus to accept evolution, even to accept Darwinism, was there such a clash? And I think the clash is due as much, if not more, to the Darwinians, or the Darwin supporters, as it was to the Christians. I think that people like Huxley set out deliberately to make a row. Now, why did they do this? Well, because England around about 1860 was a country desperately in need of change. There had been the Crimean War, where so many people had died, at the time of Florence Nightingale. Then there had been the Indian Mutiny. The cities weren't running properly. In 1857, in London, there had been what was called the Great Stink, where literally the Thames was nothing but, just a current of turds, and it smelt like it. I mean, they needed people in England to start running the country properly. They needed engineers. They needed sanitation engineers. They needed accountants. They needed people who could raise the taxes, who could run the cities. They needed policemen. They needed people to run sports and all of these things. They needed people with training. And people like Huxley were much involved in this. I like this picture because this shows Huxley at the blackboard. He was a biology teacher. He became a dean. He was a great blackboard artist. He was a great teacher. And Huxley realized that if you're going to institute education, and particularly Huxley was interested in higher education, university education, then you've got to find some way of paying for it and find some kinds of customers. I mean, if, for instance, let's say a department said, oh, well, we'd like to found a new field. Let's suppose the philosophy department at Montana said, oh, well, we'd like to start a new PhD in the philosophy of geology, or existential studies in geology. Let's say they wanted to do that. So they send somebody over to the president and they say, President, we've got this idea of starting a new PhD program in existential geology. We're going to need 5 new faculty. We're going to need lots of space, of course, and we're going to need money for graduate students. But in 5 years' time, we'll be turning out 5 existential geologists a year. We'll be the world center of existential geology. Look out, Wyoming, Idaho, you're left behind. We're, Alberta, you just don't even start. We're numero uno in existential geology. Well, what the president's going to say to you, or say to the person who's sent over, is that sounds like a good idea. My experience is administrators always say that before they turn you down. And then the president's going to say, who's going to pay for this? And the philosopher says, oh, well, I don't know, you're the president, that's your job, not mine. I'm a philosopher, I don't think about money. The president's going to say, well, I'll think about it. And of course, by the time the little philosopher's trotted back to the philosophy department, the president's been on the phone to the dean saying, that SOB, has that SOB got tenure? Can we fire him now, or do we have to wait until the end of the semester? You've got to have money to run universities, you've got to have money to run programs. And Huxley realized this. If he was going to teach biology, and he wanted to teach biology, he'd got to find customers. And he did. He turned to the doctors and he said, look, you people are killing people rather than curing them. You need to change. And the doctor said, you're damned right we do. Well, Huxley said, look, I'll take young men and I'll give them 3 years good grounding, proper training in physiology and embryology and these sorts of things, anatomy, and then you can take them and you can turn them into doctors, for the next 3 years. In fact, the doctors, the physicians said, terrific idea, give us as many students as you possibly can. And in fact, that's the way that English medical education works to this day. You do a 3-year degree in embryology and physiology and these sorts of things, and then you do your 3-year clinical after that. And then what about morphology or anatomy? Well, Huxley sold that to the teaching profession. He said to the teachers, or the heads of the teachers, he said, look, in this day and age, Latin and Greek aren't what's needed. We need people who are going to be practical people who've had hands-on experience with the world. What about anatomy? Cutting up dogfish, cutting up cats, these sorts of things. They won't be anatomists when they grow up, but they'll have had that intimate experience with physical nature and working with it with their hands. And the school teachers bought this idea. In fact, Huxley himself set up summer schools for teachers at South Kensington. That's the university, it's now Imperial College in London, where he worked. And actually, his most famous student was H.G. Wells, the novelist who wrote War of the Worlds and other things like that. So these were ways in which Huxley could push professional science. But now, what about evolution?
And the trouble with evolution, Huxley was an ardent evolutionist. There was no question about that. But he couldn't see any way in which evolution could cure a pain in the belly. And evolution seemed to be a bit risque for schools. So it wasn't going to work in that sort of way. But Huxley realized that in his drive to make a New England, an England of meritocracy, he'd not only got to push his own ideas, but he'd got to conquer those who were against the ideas. And who would be against the ideas? Well, obviously, the aristocrats and the big landowners and others who were doing very well out of English society without any change, thank you. And Huxley saw that their great ideological support was, in fact, the Church of England. It was often known as the Tory party at prayer. And I mean, even their hymns sort of underlined these sorts of things. The rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly, he ordered their estate. In other words, the way that things are is because that's what God wants. And so Huxley wanted to say absolute nonsense. So Huxley saw, not only had he got to put forward his own ideas, but he'd got to fight, as it were, the prevailing orthodoxy. And so what he needed to do this was his own religion, his own, as it were, ideology. And evolution fit the bill. The idea that everything comes from blobs and works up progressively to the top, and that through effort, through struggle, this is the way the world is going. This was absolutely the ideology, the alternative secular religion that Huxley wanted. In fact, Darwin wasn't very good at this sort of thing, but there was another man, Herbert Spencer, who was only too willing to enter into these things. And in fact, Spencer became by far the most popular evolutionist in Britain and America, actually, in the second half of the 19th century. Now, you may think I'm exaggerating, but I want you to look at the following picture. Because these evolutionists realized they'd got to do things. They couldn't just push evolution. They'd got to do it positively. And so one of the things is they built their own cathedrals. They built their own cathedrals. The idea being that people would go to these cathedrals on Sunday afternoons rather than to the spiritual cathedrals on Sunday mornings. Except they didn't call them cathedrals. They called them museums of natural history. These were places where people could go and see these panoramas of progress, particularly after you folks out west were digging up all these wonderful fossils. So you could go on a Sunday afternoon and look at this panorama of progress that leads up through the fossils to ta-dam, to humans, and ultimately, of course, to Englishmen. And if you don't believe me, look at. Now, this is the most incredible juxtaposition I have ever seen in my whole life. The top two photos are of a medieval cathedral in France. The bottom two photos are of the Museum of Natural History, and you can still see it to this day in South Kensington in London, that was built in the 1860s and 1870s. And if this wasn't an attempt to offer a kind of secular religion, a secular cathedral, I don't know what is. So what I'm saying then is that what happened to Darwinism is it got hijacked, or evolution, it got hijacked after the origin, not by the Christians, not by the religious, but by the scientists who were using Darwinism as a kind of ideology to push the vision of Britain that they desperately wanted. I mean, I don't mean that they were bad in doing this, but I do mean that they did it. And I want to suggest that at least a part of the stress and the strain that we see even to this day is a function of this. Now, let's pick up our story and enter the sort of final act of our story by picking up in America. Now, when I left America, we were just dealing with people like Benjamin Franklin, very much people of the Enlightenment, who were breaking away from Europe, breaking from British rule. And in fact, the founding fathers were very much people of the Enlightenment. It's hard to imagine in a society where in the last election we saw that everybody was so keen to get on side with Jesus. You know, I'm keener on Jesus than you are. No, I'm better on Jesus than you are, sort of thing. It's hard to imagine, but the first 7 presidents of the United States of America, theologically, were not Christians. All of them denied the Trinity. They all thought that Jesus was a good bloke, but they didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. The classic case was Washington. Washington was an Episcopalian, but he would never take communion, because to do so would be to acknowledge that Jesus was God, and that for him would be sacrilegious. In fact, a lovely story is that communion, I think, was held by the Anglicans once a month or something like that, and the parson or the vicar said to Washington, General Washington, I notice that you never take communion when you come to church. Don't you think you're setting a bad example? And Washington said, you know, you're absolutely right. And so from then on Communion Sunday, he just wouldn't go to church at all. And yet, although America was founded by Enlightenment men, very quickly, at least major parts of America became very otherwise. Very quickly, major parts of America became or continued intensely religious. And what we find is the evolution now of what I would describe as an indigenous form of Protestant Christianity, which is going to be now newly very heavily Bible-based. I say Protestant because we're at a time well before the Catholics or the Jews start to pour into America in significant numbers. And particularly in the South, and as the country starts to move out west, you see that this is very important. You see, what's happening is it's all very well to found your own country, but then you've got to build it. And it was damned hard work. Now, one was driven, as it were, inspired by the view that of course, Americans are the new Jews, these are the chosen people. I mean, you see this particularly in the Mormons, but this idea that this is a specially divinely chosen country, but it doesn't mean that it isn't hard work, and particularly in the South, and particularly as the country moved west, people were looking for ways to run their lives. They didn't have the old customs of the old country, the villages and the traditions and the laws. So they looked for something else as a substitute. And it is this point that the great preachers start to move in. In fact, we have at this point what is known as the first half of the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening. The first was at the beginning of the 18th century when the Methodists and these sort of people developed, particularly in America. And so what we find is the Billy Grahams of the day, people like Charles Grandison Finney, come along and say, we can tell you how to run your lives, or rather, we can tell you how to find out how to run your lives. Turn to the Bible. This is a time now when the tax is taken off printing, Bibles become freely available, every home can have one. You don't have to go to church where it's chained to the lectern and only the vicar can read it. It's something that everybody has. And what people were taught is turn to the Bible for guidance for life. How should a husband treat his wife? How should parents treat their children? How should a master treat a servant, and conversely? Look to the good book will tell you. And what you find, particularly as the century goes on to the middle, that in the South, and as I say, as the country starts to move out west, you find that this biblically based form of Protestant Christianity really takes root in a big way. I know that cowboy movies are sentimental and idealized, but when you see movies like Shane, for instance, where you've got this sort of simple religion which is very much based on Bible reading, this sort of thing, this is not inaccurate by any means. Now, we come to the Civil War. And of course, this is the great dividing point in American history. What happens in the Civil War, or what happens after the Civil War? Well, the Civil War is won by the North. And after the Civil War, in many respects, the North now feels liberated to go the way of Europe, to go the way of industry, to go the way of Enlightenment. And so what we find in the North is that the ideology of progress becomes the ideology of the day. That big industries like Andrew Carnegie's steelworks are founded, and new universities are built, particularly in the North, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore It's founded in 1876. It's founded on the German plan, so there's going to be lots of science. Keep the classics down, but lots of science, lots of technology, these sort of things, big medical school. And who was the first convocation speaker in 1880? None other than our old friend Thomas Henry Huxley. So in other words, the North is going very much the Huxley way. Even the preachers are getting involved in this. This is Henry Ward Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Henry Ward Beecher was the silver-tongued preacher in New York of his day. He was also a notorious adulterer, but unlike Bill Clinton, got away with it. And look at what he has to say about evolution. Who designed this mighty machine, created matter, gave it its laws, and impressed upon it that tendency which has brought forth the almost infinite results on the globe and wrought them into a perfect system? Design by wholesale, evolution, is grander than design by retail, in other words, miracles. So what you're seeing in Northern Christianity is they're even internalizing notions of progress and this sort of thing. So this is the way that the North goes, and they're embracing progress and evolution along with it. And you see this to this day. If you look at the writings of somebody like Edward O. Wilson, the great Harvard entomologist and sociobiologist, who's just recently written a book called The Creation, Wilson is ardently in favor of progress. Progress lead up to humans. For some reason, sociobiological man is always a marionette controlled by the genes. But certainly for Wilson, we are the apotheosis of the evolutionary process, even with our moral rules. Because if we don't preserve things like the Brazilian rainforest, because humans live in symbiotic relationship with nature, unless we are prepared to live with and preserve these things, life as we know it will collapse. So in other words, he's got this whole secular ideology, this secular religion, complete with, as I say, moral directives. And so you get this is the one side. What about the South? Well, the South, of course, was defeated. The South felt particularly hard done by because they felt that they were the true biblical followers. The Bible, if you read the Bible seems to endorse slavery. I mean, when Abraham makes his covenant with God, God doesn't say, okay, now I'm going to call you Abraham, and by the way, I'd like you to free your slaves. No, what he says to Abraham is, oh, and by the way, circumcise the male slaves too. And when the slave comes to St. Paul in the New Testament, Paul doesn't say, okay, end of slavery. St. Paul says, go back to your master and obey him. He also says, by the way, masters, look after your slaves. Now, you can put it in context, because Christianity was, in many respects, a religion much taken up by slaves, and if St. Paul had started to stir up that particular pie, or fire, then there would have been more persecution of Christians faster than there was in any case. But the fact is, if you read the Bible, at least in a literal sense, it seems as though it endorses slavery. I'm not saying that the Bible does endorse slavery. I can't see that slavery is compatible with the Sermon on the Mount. The point I'm making is that if you're into this kind of literalistic reading, which people in the South were into, then it seems to endorse slavery. More than this, after the Civil War, they all read the passages which suggests or which says that God chastises those whom he loves the most, the Israelites in captivity. Sermon after sermon after sermon likened the South to the Israelites in captivity in Babylon. So what we get, far from a turning from this biblical literalism, is an intensification because of the events of the Civil War. And what we find again is that preachers come in and endorse and reinforce it. This is Dwight Moody. And what did Moody say were the four great dangers of the age? Ignoring the Sabbath, Sunday newspapers, the theater, and evolution, including atheism. You see, what is happening, and I don't think that Moody or anybody else worried about the fossil record, but what is happening is that evolution is being identified correctly with progress. It's being identified with the North correctly, and this is hated. So the point I'm making is that what we're finding by the end of the 19th century, particularly in the South, and as I say, as the country moves west and takes this kind of religion with it, is that evolution becomes a kind of litmus test for where you stand. It's not the science as such. What it is what evolution stands for. In the North, it stands for progress and moving forward, science, technology, Johns Hopkins, and that sort of thing. In the South, it stands for Israelites in captivity, or rather, they're into Israelites in captivity, anti-progress, pro-providence, pro-biblical literalism, anti-evolution. So as I say, evolution gets caught up in this very big divide, and I think it continues right through the 20th century. We see it, for instance, in the works which gave the name the fundamentalists, these works on literalism in about 1915. We see it particularly in the Scopes monkey trial. This is John Thomas Scopes, who was found guilty of teaching evolution in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. Fascinating. I mean, the movie about it, which is a great movie, Inherit the Wind, in fact, isn't true to the facts at all. The facts are that it is true that Scopes was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan, 3 times presidential candidate, and defended by Clarence Darrow, the noted agnostic lawyer who just got Leopold and Loeb off from the gas chamber or electric chair the year before. But the point is, if you look at the trial isn't even over literalism, because in fact, when William Jennings Bryan was asked by Clarence Darrow, did he believe in 6 days, literal days of creation? In fact, Bryan said no. He said, as far as I'm concerned, the Bible says that 1,000 years are as but a day in the eye of the Lord, and a day is as 1,000 years. He said, personally, I believe in long periods of time. That wasn't the issue. The big issue was the cultural thing. That here were northern ideas being brought down and imposed on the kids of Tennessee, and the parents and the legislators and everybody else disliked this intensely. And so this was what was going on. It was a culture trial. And we see this after the Second World War with the growth of evolution, of creationist ideas, Genesis flood, which came up in 1961. And I think, and I draw towards my final act, I think that we see this also today in the case of the so-called intelligent design movement, which, as I said, was certainly, I won't say founded, but certainly given its big spur by the Berkeley lawyer Philip Johnson. Now, I don't want to go into great detail here, but I want to go into enough detail to illustrate what I'm talking about. Intelligent design, which probably the person who's done most to push the idea is this man, Michael Behe, in his 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box. And Behe says, he's a biochemist, by the way, at Lehigh University. Behe says, sometimes in the world, you encounter examples of what he calls irreducible complexity. These are things put together from various parts, where if you don't have all the parts put together in one fell swoop, it won't work. And his example is that of a mousetrap. He says a mousetrap has 5 parts, and unless all of those 5 parts, the spring and the balancing bar or holding bar and the platform, unless these are, as it were, made separately and then assembled by a thinking being, then it won't work. And he says this is a case of irreducible complexity. It could not have come about gradually, step by step. It needs a one, as it were, step intervention by an intelligent being. And then Behe says, well, if we look at the organic world, we find similar examples. Blood clotting, when the blood clots, if you're not a hemophiliac, in fact, is a very complex process which requires 28 steps. It's known as the blood clotting cascade. And Behe says this couldn't have happened unless these were all put together at one point. And so we must have had an intelligent designer do this. And of course, although Behe's a bit cagey about it, if you look at his emails and elsewhere, the intelligent designer is, in fact, the great blood plotter in the sky. In other words, it's God. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about this on right or wrong, although I would say that the mousetrap has given us evolutionists, us Darwinians, many happy hours of invention. B. Hayes says a mousetrap has to have 5 parts. Well, you can imagine, it wasn't long before some creative evolutionist had made a functioning mousetrap with 4 parts. And then another one went better and made a functioning mousetrap with 3 parts. And then, not to be outdone, somebody made a mousetrap with 2 parts. And they even made a mousetrap with 1 part. It wasn't a very good mousetrap, but in the land of the mousetrapless, the 1-part mousetrap is king. And word has it that at Harvard, they've now got a very large grant, and they're hoping to make a mousetrap with no parts whatsoever. They haven't got there yet, but, you know, they're sure they will. And when they've got it, it'll obviously cure cancer, so they'll need more grant money. But anyhow, the point I want to make is not that this is, you know, incredibly anti-scientific. It really is. The point I want to make is, in fact, I think that the intelligent design movement, as right down the line, has been, what shall I say, an excuse, a cover for a deeper, if you like, a broader moral agenda, the agenda which we saw back in the 19th century, that literalism agenda, that Old Testament, St. Paul-based agenda of this is the way that you ought to run your life. And the way you ought to run your life is not the way of those soft-minded, liberal Christian progressionists of the North. And in fact, if you look at the books by Philip Johnson, you find that this comes out very quickly. Sure, Johnson puts Darwin on trial and finds him guilty and leads him away for a very long time. But by and large, Johnson isn't that worried about evolution as such. He's not lying awake at night worrying about gaps in the fossil record. But he makes it very clear, both in this book and in some of his later books, that his real concern are the moral issues. That if you're an evolutionist, then you're going to be soft on banning abortion, because you're going to have this sort of northern ideas that, you know, a woman's body is her own property and that sort of thing, and that's anti-biblical. You're going to be influenced by people like Freud and the sociobiologists, suggesting that maybe homosexuality is not an evil, not a sickness, maybe natural. You're even going to go so far as to endorse gay marriage. And what you find is the intelligent designers, when they, as it were, as soon as they can, they move from talking about evolution to talking about what's wrong with the society, namely things like allowing gay marriage. And capital punishment is another big one. These, in fact, are the conspirators who shot Abraham Lincoln being hanged. And again, you find running through the writings of the intelligent designers, and before them, the scientific creationists. If we're soft on morals, if we adopt things like evolution, then we're going to be soft on things like capital punishment. I mean, you know, at one level it's ridiculous. I have been accused of being a cause of America's softness on capital punishment because of my evolutionism. Now, if only it were true, if only it were true. But at another level, you see this kind of, this, I won't say perverted, but this direct connection between evolution, which, as I say, is a symbol for a much deeper cultural divide. And for some reason, particularly Philip Johnson, has this thing about cross-dressing, that somehow evolution is going to lead to cross-dressing. You know, it boggles the mind. At supper tonight, I met a very nice young biologist, a young man who's just joined your campus as Dean of the Biological Sciences. And he seems like a really nice guy, and I'm sure he's going to be a great credit to your campus. But, you know, is this a guy who goes home at the end of the day and says, "Dear God, I've had one hell of a day with the population geneticists. I've never met such a crazy bunch in all my life. I'm worn out. Darling, would you mind fixing me a strong gin and tonic? And by the way, has my pink nightie come back from the cleaners yet?" You know, I mean, really, I mean, if the idea that evolution leads to cross-dressing is ridiculous, unless, well, it's ridiculous anyway. But why would somebody make a claim like this, except and otherwise that they're putting it in an overall context about that evolution represents a kind of way of thinking which leads to this kind of moral laxness. So I show you, to complete, a picture of the election in the last, the way that the election went in the last election. And of course what we see is that this is a very clear pattern, that the blue states, the northern states, the evolution states are clustered up there and down the coast, and then in the south and moving right across through the west you see the red states, the moral value states, the anti-evolution states. And what I want to say, and I conclude here, is I'm not surprised, because my ultimate message is that the evolution-creation debate or struggle is not a struggle about science at all. It's a struggle about, what should we call it, the moral heart of America. And I think until we recognize that, we're never going to bring people together. Thank you.
There you go. I did tell you, I did warn you.
I know, that's right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ruse is going to take some questions. We'll spend a few minutes doing it. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd ask you to please come down and use the microphones which are in the hallways, introduce yourself, and let us know what the question is. So I'll field the questions. Where should we get started?
Do you want to go over to the mic? So.
Okay, Dr. Ruse. I was wondering, do you have an opinion or an idea of the trend that you see our country taking?
I'm sorry, could you speak again?
Okay, do you have an idea of the trend that you see for the future of the U.S., I guess?
I take it your question is, do I see some trend as how this dispute is going to work out? Is that what you're asking me, or what?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the question is, what do I think is going to happen in the future? And my first response is, you are very naive to ask a philosopher to tell you about what's going to happen in the future, because if ever there was a group of people who are incapable of making predictions, it's philosophers. The only difference between us and the rest of you is we know that. I think, if I'm right, then it's not going to depend on somebody coming up with a great new proof of evolution. Because as I've said, or let's say somebody at this university finding a new fossil, I just don't think that's going to make any difference at all. Because if I'm right, that what we're dealing with is a much deeper cultural divide. And I think that if things are going to change, they're only going to change inasmuch as we can start to break down that cultural divide. Now, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said I see things as pretty grim. Bush had just put a couple of very conservative people on the Supreme Court. It looked as though the nation was strongly behind him in Iraq and these sorts of things. But as you well know, the administration has started to come apart very quickly, very badly. And my suspicion is that I certainly hope that what we're going to see is something of swing. I don't mean a swing where suddenly we're all going to become liberals rather than conservatives. But I would like to think that we might see a swing where more and more Americans are going to say, look, maybe there's something to the other side. I mean, I think you're going to have 25%, as it were, on each side who are not going to be budged. But maybe there can be more dialogue in the middle, where people can start to say, well, okay, let's recognize the strengths of science, maybe even let's recognize some of the strengths of evolution. But let's at the same time recognize that this is not going to necessarily be threatening to my faith. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm against people like Dawkins Dawkins, just as much as I'm against Philip Johnson, because I think Dawkins is just as unhelpful as Philip Johnson. But now, whether I'm right or not, I'm not quite sure, but you just have to keep plugging on.
How's it going? I have a question regarding free will, and where or how does science allow for people to have free will and therefore take responsibility for their own actions?
The questions about free will and responsibility and action. Well, I think I would want to start with this. Anybody who says we don't have free will is just plain silly, because obviously we do have free will. You had the freedom to come to the talk tonight or not. I mean, you may have been under some pressure. Your prof may have said to you, if I don't see you at the course, at the lecture, I'm going to take 10% off or something. I mean, nevertheless, you could have said, well, to hell with that, I'll take a B and be proud of it. I think we've all got free will. So then I think the question comes, what kind of free will we've got, and what kind of free will does evolution allow us to have? Now, a common criticism against Darwinism is that it locks us into some form of genetic determinism, rather like that picture I showed you of us being marionettes on the, at the beck and call of DNA. And it just seems to me that that's just plain wrong. I mean, I think that ants are at the beck and call of DNA. I don't think ants are thinking beings. I don't think ants are free beings. I think ants do what they do because they're programmed by their genes to do it. But I think the way that we've evolved is such that we do have a dimension of freedom that ants don't have. That if, for instance, things go wrong, we can try to put them right in a way that ants can't. I mean, if something goes wrong, ants are very good until something goes wrong, and then they can't do anything about it. They're just lost. Whereas we, both through our nature and through our training, I think have that dimension. Now, whether that means we escape the causal chain, I think is another matter entirely. In fact, I'm inclined to think probably we don't. But I would certainly defend strongly the notion that we've got free will, and more than that, I would say that Darwinian evolutionary biology demands that of humans rather than denies it. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. Ruse. I'm particularly interested in your suggestion that evolution had sort of attached itself to a lot of cultural values and divides in the United States history. But one thing that it seems that there's a little bit of a dissonance between some progressive values and natural evolution. Particularly, I'm thinking of things like equality of all mankind and justice, and even a preference for marginalized and disenfranchised people. And you mentioned Malthus's original theories were quite conservative, and Herbert Spencer and Huxley, and some of the original nexus between natural evolution and some social theories were not what we would think of today as progressive. And I'm just curious about how historically that would have worked itself out if it really was adapted into more of a progressive value system.
Well, I take it that the question we've got is about the whole connection between science and values, and particularly evolutionary theory and some of these questions, right? You notice that when I was giving my lecture, one thing I was not doing was necessarily endorsing what people like, say, Thomas Henry Huxley and Edward L. Wilson were doing. In fact, I'm all in favor of protecting the rainforests. But I have to say, I myself am very uncomfortable about the ways in which, right from the beginning, evolutionists have, in fact, entwined their theory so often with ideologies, whether it be ideologies of social Darwinism, for instance, that, nature red in tooth and claw, and that violence is natural, or whether it's other ideologies like, say, Prince Kropotkin, who wanted to say we've evolved a sort of a sentiment of mutual aid, and therefore the natural evolutionary thing to do is to work together in universal brotherhood. It always seems to me that that's a step too far in the connection sense. I'm not necessarily against the conclusions, but I don't accept that kind of jump from one to the other. And I personally would want to say I don't think you have to. And if I were going to elaborate on my lecture and give another one, I would want to say that in fact, my belief is that evolutionary theory in the 20th century has developed in such a way as you get this kind of split now between, let's call it Darwinism, which is this kind of ideology, and Darwinian evolutionary theory, which I would say is a fairly straightforward, pretty value-free kind of enterprise. So when I talked to the biologists here on campus at lunchtime, I wasn't, prodding away and expecting them to say, and hence we see that fruit flies, justify democracy and show that we were wrong to go into Iraq. I think we were wrong to go into Iraq. I like fruit flies, but I don't think the one leads to the other. And I don't think it has to, and I would go further. I would be appalled if, in fact, the teachers on this campus were even getting into, floated those ideas, certainly not in biology classes. So, but my feeling is that I think that you can draw a distinction between these things, and I think that you should. On the other hand, if somebody like Ed Wilson wants to say, I believe that evolution leads to, to beliefs that we should look after the rainforest, I'm prepared to work with Wilson just as much as somebody who says, I'm a Christian, and I believe as a Christian that we've got stewardship of the land and that God has given us this obligation to look after the land, and I'm prepared, I'm like Churchill in the Second World War. I might not agree with everything that Stalin did and said, but by God, those Germans have got to be beaten, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so I personally am prepared to work with an awful lot of people to get the kind of ends I want. Are you asking me about questions to do with evolutionary theory and whether evolutionary theory is tainted by fraud so that...
Not fraud. Frogs. As in...
Frogs? Oh, frogs. Oh, well... What the hell? Fraud, frogs, I don't care. I'm happy. They're all one to me. Frogs.
Frogs are evolving in certain areas that you can actually see, and the rattlesnakes around Las Vegas don't rattle and therefore are surviving longer. That's actual evidence of evolution. How has this impacted the debate?
Listen, I'm not going to take Las Vegas as a model or as an example for anything. Really, that's a bit of a low blow. Let me put it this way. There's no question that human effects or human activities and the things that we produce, whether deliberately or as a byproduct, can have very serious effects on the environment. And that they can clearly, not only, you're quite right, cause mutations and things like that, but just as seriously, they can have, very severe selective effects as well. That if you do certain things, let's say, obviously, a case in point would be global warming. That clearly global warming is not only affecting humans, but it's having very fundamental effects on organisms, where we're now seeing, for instance, you read these articles about the bees, the killer bees, which are able to move further and further north because it's warmer, it's warmer. And of course, as this happens, they come into contact with other species, including other species of bees, and you're going to get struggles for existence, and you're going to get consequent evolution. So the fact of the matter is, evolution, in any case, even if humans weren't around, is going to keep going. I would certainly entertain the hypothesis that humans are having a very dramatic effect on evolution. More than just, mutated frogs in Las Vegas, which are probably considered, maybe even to be a good thing. But clearly extinction, and this is something that Wilson is very desperately worried about. Extinction is going on at such a rate because of human activity, whether it be clearing the rainforests or flooding. I mean, something I've just been reading about is the growing of strawberries in Spain. And this is done in the south of Spain, where they've flooded or dried out certain marshes and introduced all sorts of plastics and this sort of thing. And clearly these are having very significant, not just environmental effects, but evolutionary effects as well.
So thank you again for your time. My question is, it seems to me that more often than not, if you have a truly rational person and they have an idea or concept that they hold firm to, if you can argue rationally and disprove that they tend to, accept the new rational solution to the problem. Whereas, and I don't want to generalize, but, someone who's firmly entrenched in their faith is, sort of, self-fulfilling and almost, unmovable just on the basis of their faith. So do you see any either scientific or social development ever? I mean, I don't even expect within our lifetime to ever dislodge the, the idea of religion or mysticism or...
I think the question, or at least the implied question, is that I'm being a little pessimistic and that I'm rather putting down the power of reason and rational argument. And what I'm being asked is, do I see any chance of change in the future? And particularly, if we stopped adopting my position and introduced a little more reason into the debate, couldn't we do a little bit better? Am I misunderstanding you? Now, the question, can I ask you a personal question first? As how old are you? 21. Well, I'm so glad to hear 21's people in Montana still have the idealism that you have. At the age of 6, I believed in reason too at the age of 21, except when I was dealing with my girlfriend. And then I have to say, as far as I was concerned, reason went out of the window. I became a blubbering mass of emotion. But anyhow, of course I don't want to knock reason. I mean, God, I'm a professional philosopher. And, every morning, like Catholics have to say prayers, we get up and we have to say things like, I believe in reason, I believe in reason. The synthetic a priori is a good thing, I believe in reason, hail Kant. I mean, we have to do that. I mean, we're not going to get through the day unless we do this sort of thing. And of course, so I'm not obviously a complete cynic about reason, but I'm also very much convinced that often in order to effect changes, reason, yes, but also you've got to speak to people's emotions and to how people feel about things, and if people feel threatened about things, and this sort of thing. I mean, for instance, I think that a great thing for evolutionists to do would be to present a lot more attractive pictures and books and models of what they're doing. Now, at one level, I think this would be reason, but at another level, I think that this might speak to people's emotions, rather just like those museums did. So, I think you're right, but I'm a little more cynical than you are about, just pure undiluted reason.
Please join me in thanking our speaker. Professor Ruse will be available. He's signing copies of several of his books in case you're interested. Thank you very much.